What is unconscious cannot be abolished by proclamation or prohibition. One can, however, develop sensitivity toward recognizing it and begin to experience it consciously, and thus eventually gain control over it. A mother cannot truly respect her child as long as she does not realize what deep shame she causes him with an ironic remark intended only to cover her own uncertainty. Indeed, she cannot be aware of how deeply humiliated, despised, and devalued her child feels if she herself has never consciously suffered these feelings, and if she tries to fend them off with irony. The same can be said for most psychiatrists, clinical psychologists, and therapists. Certainly, they do not use words like bad, dirty, naughty, egoistic, rotten, but among themselves they sometimes speak of narcissistic, exhibitionistic, destructive, regressive, or borderline patients without noticing that they give these words a pejorative meaning. It may be that their abstract vocabulary, their supposedly objective attitudes, even the way they formulate their theories and zealously make their diagnoses, all have something in common with a mother's contemptuous looks, which they could, if they were willing, trace to the accommodating 3-year-old girl or boy within themselves. It is understandable that a patient's scornful attitude could induce a therapist to protect his superiority with the help of theory, but if he builds such a wall, the patient's true self will not be visible to him. It will hide from him just as it did from the mother's disgusted eyes. We could, however, make good use of our sensitivity by, instead, detecting pieces of the story of a despised child that lie behind all the patient's expressions of contempt. When the therapist's resources are used in this way, it is easier for him not to feel he is being attacked and to drop his need to hide behind his theories. Knowledge of theory is essential, but knowledge of the theory must not have a defensive function. It must not become the successor of a strict, controlling mother, forcing the therapist to accommodate himself to it. Depravity as evil in Hermann Hesse's childhood world. It is very difficult to describe how people deal with the contempt under which they suffered as children, especially the contempt for all their sensual enjoyment and pleasure in living, without giving concrete examples. With the aid of theoretical models, I could certainly describe the various defense mechanisms, especially the defense against feelings, but doing so would fail to communicate the emotional climate, which alone evokes a person's suffering and so makes identification and empathy possible for the reader. With purely theoretical representations, we therapists remain outside. From there we can talk about the others, classify, group, and label them by making diagnoses and discuss them in a language only we understand. If we refuse to do all that, we need examples. It is only through the details of a specific life that we can show how a person has experienced the naughtiness of his childhood as wickedness itself. Only the history of an individual life can make us realize how impossible it is for a child to recognize his parents' compulsions as such, and to realize that this blindness can persist throughout the adult's whole life, try as he may to break out of his inner prison. I use the example of the poet and novelist Hermann Hesse to demonstrate this very complicated situation. This example has the advantage of having been published, and published by the person himself, so that the connections that I postulate can be clarified with concrete examples from his life. At the beginning of his novel Damien, Hermann Hesse describes the goodness and purity of a parental home in which there is no room for a child's fibs. It is not difficult to recognize the author's own parental home in this novel, and he confirms this indirectly. The child is alone with his sin and feels that he is depraved, wicked, and outcast, though nobody scolds him, since no one as yet knows the terrible facts. This situation is of course a common one in real life, and Hesse's idealized way of describing such a pure household is not strange to us either. It reflects both the child's point of view and the hidden cruelty of commonplace methods with which we are only too familiar, used to teach moral values. Like most parents, writes Hesse, mine were no help with the new problems of puberty, to which no reference was ever made. All they did was take endless trouble in supporting my hopeless attempts to deny reality and to continue dwelling in a childhood world that was becoming more and more unreal. I have no idea whether parents can be of help, and I do not blame mine. It was my own affair to come to terms with myself and to find my own way, and like most well-brought-up children, I managed it badly. A child's parents seem to him to be free of sexual desires, for they have means and possibilities of hiding their sexual activities, whereas the child is always under surveillance. The first part of Demian, it seems to me, is very evocative and easy to appreciate, even for people from quite different milieus. What makes the later parts of the novel so peculiarly difficult must in some way be related to Hesse's parents' and grandparents' moral values. They were missionary families. These permeate many of his stories, but can perhaps be most easily sensed in Demian. Although Sinclair, the hero, has already had his own experience of cruelty, blackmailed by an older boy, it has given him no key to a better understanding of the world. Wickedness, for him, is depravity. Here is the missionary's language. It is neither hate nor cruelty, but such trivialities as drinking in a tavern. As a little boy, Hermann Hesse took over from his parents this particular concept of wickedness as depravity. It is like a foreign body that he seeks to locate and uproot from his personality. This is why everything that happens in Demian, after the appearance of the god Abraxas, who is to unite the godly and the devilish, is so curiously removed. Wickedness is supposed to be artfully united with goodness here, but we are not touched by it. One has the impression that, for the boy, this is something strange, threatening, and above all unknown, from which he nevertheless cannot be free himself. His emotional belief in depravity is already joined to fear and guilt. Once more, I was trying most strenuously to construct an intimate world of light for myself out of the shambles of a period of devastation. Once more, I sacrificed everything within me to the aim of banishing darkness and evil from myself. In the Zurich exhibition, to commemorate the centennial of Hesse's birth, a picture was displayed that had hung above the little Hermann's bed and that he had grown up with. In this picture, on the right, we see the good road to heaven, full of thorns, difficulties, and suffering. On the left, we see the easy, pleasurable road that inevitably leads to hell. Taverns play a prominent part on this road, probably because devout women hope to keep their husbands and sons away from these wicked places with this threatening representation. These taverns play an important role in Demian, ironically so, because Hesse had no urge at all to get drunk in such taverns, though he certainly did wish to break out of the narrowness of his parents' values. Every child forms his first image of what is bad quite concretely by what is forbidden, by his parents' prohibitions, taboos, and fears. He will have a long way to go before he can free himself from these parental values and see without filters what he has believed to be badness in himself. He will then no longer regard it as depraved and wicked, but as a comprehensible latent reaction to injuries he had to repress when a child. As an adult, he can discover the causes and free himself from this unconscious reaction. He also has the opportunity to apologize for what he has done to others out of ignorance, blindness, and confusion. and doing so will help him to avoid repetitions of acts he no longer wishes to continue. Unfortunately, the path to clarification was not open to Hermann Hesse. The following passage from Demian shows how deeply the perceived loss of his parents' love threatened his search for his true self. But where we have given of our love and respect not from habit but of our own free will, where we have been disciples and friends out of our most inmost hearts, it is a bitter and horrible moment when we suddenly recognize that the current within us wants to pull us away from what is dearest to us. Then every thought that rejects the friend and mentor turns on our own hearts like a poisoned barb. Then each blow struck in defense flies back into one's own face. The words disloyalty and ingratitude strike the person who feels he was morally sound, like catcalls and stigma, and the frightened heart flees timidly back to the charmed valleys of childhood virtues. Unable to believe that this break, too, must be made, this bond also broken. And in his story, A Child's Heart, we read, "If I were to reduce all my feelings and their painful conflicts to a single name, I can think of no other word but dread. It was dread and uncertainty that I felt in all those hours of shattered childhood felicity. Dread of punishment, dread of my own conscience, dread of stirrings in my soul which I considered forbidden and criminal." In this story, Hesse portrays with great tenderness and understanding the feelings of an 11-year-old boy who has stolen some dried figs from his beloved father's room so that he could have in his possession something that belongs to his father. Guilt feelings, fear, and despair torment him in his loneliness and are replaced at last by the deepest humiliation and shame when his wicked deed is discovered. The strength of this portrayal leads us to surmise that it concerns a real episode from Hesse's own childhood. This surmise becomes certainty thanks to a note made by his mother on November 11, 1889, Hermann's theft of figs discovered. From the entries in his mother's diary and from the extensive exchange of letters between both parents and various members of the family, which have been available since 1966, it is possible to guess at the small boy's painful path. Hesse, like so many gifted children, was so difficult for his parents to bear, not despite but because of his inner riches. Often a child's very gifts, his great intensity of feeling, depth of experience, curiosity, intelligence, quickness, and his ability to be critical, will confront his parents with conflicts that they have long sought to keep at bay by means of rules and regulations. These regulations must then be rescued at the cost of the child's development. All this can lead to an apparently paradoxical situation when parents who are proud of their gifted child and who even admire him are forced by their own repression to reject, suppress, or even destroy what is best, because truest, in that child. Two of Hesse's mother's observations may illustrate how this work of destruction can be combined with apparent loving care. 1. 1881. Hermann is going to nursery school. His violent temperament causes us much distress. The child was 3 years old. 2. 1884. Things are going better with Hermann, whose education causes us much distress and trouble. From the 21st of January to the 5th of June, he lived wholly in the boys' house and only spent Sundays with us. He behaved well there, but came home pale, thin, and depressed. The effects are decidedly good and salutary. He is much easier to manage now. The child now was 7 years old. On November 14, 1883, his father, Johannes Hesse, wrote, "Hermann, who was considered almost a model of good behavior in the boys' house, is sometimes hardly to be borne, though it would be very humiliating for us. I am earnestly considering whether we should not place him in an institution or another household. We are too nervous and weak for him, and the whole household is too undisciplined and irregular. He seems to be gifted for everything. He observes the moon and the clouds, extemporizes for long periods on the harmonium, draws wonderful pictures with pencil or pen, can sing quite well when he wants to, and is never at a loss for a rhyme. In the strongly idealized picture of his childhood and his parents that we encounter in Hermann Lauscher, Hesse has completely abandoned the original, rebellious, difficult, and, for his parents, troublesome child he once was. He had no way to accommodate this important part of his self and was so forced to expel it. Perhaps this is why his great and genuine longing for his true self remained unfulfilled. That Hermann Hesse was not deficient in courage, talent, or depth of feeling is, of course, evident in his works and in many of his letters, especially the outraged letter from the institution in Stettin. But his father's answer to this letter, his mother's notes, and the passages from Demian, and the child's heart, quoted above, show us clearly how the crushing weight of the denial of his childhood pain pressed on him. Despite his enormous acclaim and success, and despite the Nobel Prize, Hesse in his mature years suffered from the tragic and painful state of being separated from his true self, to which doctors refer offhandedly as depression.